You didn't choose to be born into this life story. You just woke up one day inside it, restless, aching, and deeply confused. There's a hunger inside you. At first, it looks like lust. Not just physical lust, but psychological lust, a longing to be seen, admired, touched. A hunger to feel powerful, important, chosen. A craving for escape, for intensity, for something to make you forget this painful, grinding emptiness. You search for it in faces, in screens, and strangers. You flirt, consume, chase, fantasize. But still you feel the ache of it. The contradiction, that everything you reach for ends up hollow. That even when your desire is fulfilled, the ache doesn't leave. Sometimes it gets worse. And beneath that ache, something deeper. A disorientation. Like you've been split down the middle, and no one ever taught you how to deal with this madness. Let's dive into this madness. At the heart of the Parsifal myth is a spiritual polarity, the dynamic between the masculine and feminine archetypes within the psyche. Not man and woman, but two forces in every human soul. One is the feminine, soft, emotional, nurturing, intuitive. She's the part of you that wants to hold, to feel, to stay safe. She is the dreamer, the lover, the one who longs for wholeness. But she can also be anxious, clutching, so afraid of losing love that she hides you from the world, even from yourself. The other is the masculine, bold, structured, rational, and assertive. He gives form, action, and direction. He builds, he separates, he defines. But he too has a shadow. He can become distant, cold, brittle, unprotecting his pride at the cost of his soul. They're inner patterns and they're in conflict. And you, caught in the middle, not fully one or the other, feel like a child walking in a world with no map. In a soul that is whole, these forces dance, not dominate. But when trauma, guilt, or control distort them, they turn into masks. The masculine becomes tyranny. The feminine becomes seduction or silence. And the war begins, not between people, but inside you. This is where it begins. The ache, the split, the voice in you asking, what am I really chasing? Is this pain a punishment or a message? You think it's just lust or ambition. But if you look more closely, with honesty, not shame, you'll see it. A wound you never knew how to name. Not a wound from a single person, but from a disconnection. A loss of your own inner alignment. You've been pulled into fragments, hungry, half awake, acting out old scripts, and it isn't your fault. No one taught you how to see it, but now the desire becomes something else. Not a craving to feel good, but a yearning to understand. Why am I this way? Where did this ache begin? And could there be something sacred beneath the wound? This is when your journey truly starts. Not by running toward another fantasy, but by standing still, inside your own hunger, and asking real questions. That's when the world begins to change. The symbols arrive. The story begins. Here you step into a myth much older than you. A story of division, temptation, redemption, and healing. Now you are about to meet its characters. The wounded king, the fallen magician, the sorrowful temptress, the pure seeker. But none of them are strangers. Each one is a mirror. And when you begin to see yourself in all of them, you'll understand why the wound was never a punishment. It was an invitation. This is not just a myth, it's your reflection. The story of Parsifal isn't something you read to escape. It's what you face when you stop running, when the masks fall off, when the ache in your chest no longer numbs itself with fantasy, or power, or pleasure. It is not a story about someone. It is a story inside you, a map of the soul, told through symbols that outlived empires. Because the human spirit keeps circling back to the same questions. What do I do with the pain I cannot fix? How do I live with the part of me that's wounded? Is there a way to love without betraying myself again? These questions live at the center of the Parsifal legend. Parsifal's story begins not in a castle, but in isolation. Raised by a mother who had lost her husband to war, Parsifal was kept far from the world, far from violence, far from temptation, far from knowledge. She wanted to preserve his innocence, not out of love alone, but out of fear. But like all sons, Parsifal eventually heard the distant call of life. He left his mother and her protection behind, and she died soon after. He wandered through lands of strange men and noble knights, led by curiosity and instinct. And by chance, or fate, he came upon a wounded king, Amfortas. Parsifal saw his suffering. He felt it, the pain in the air, the king's wounded body, the silence that begged to be broken. But he said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't yet understand what healing truly asks of us. He didn't ask, "What ails you?" Those questions weren't just words. They were a threshold, a sign of readiness to step into someone else's pain, not as a bystander, but as a participant. Parsifal wasn't ready. He felt the wound, but he feared what it would demand of him, so he stayed silent. And that silence became guilt. Not because he failed to speak, but because he failed to act, to respond. It's not enough to feel someone's pain. It's not enough to ask questions. What heals is the willingness to carry what the answer brings, to be changed by it and responsible to it. Parsifal didn't yet have that strength, so he left quietly and carried with him the weight of that moment. Not just a missed chance, but a lesson. But this isn't about Parsifal. This is about you. Each character in this myth is a living force in you. Amfortas is the part of you that once touched something sacred and then fell. The one who knows the truth but can't live it. Parsifal is the part that is born innocent but must suffer to mature, who fails at first but chooses to return. Kundry is the wild, conflicted feminine, half lover, half exile. She tempts but she weeps. She longs to serve, but she's trapped by shame. Klingsor is the shadow masculine, who tried to conquer his desires by force and became consumed by them. These are not separate roles. They're phases of your inner life. They emerge as you grow, fall, and remember what you forgot. And their story reveals that healing does not come from repressing one or the other, but from understanding their sacred union. In the chapters ahead, we'll meet each of these characters, not as figures in a distant tale, but as living truths in your own path. Their beauty, their distortions, their wounds, their wisdom. You'll see how a man like Amfortas can hold the divine and still fall. How a woman like Kundry can carry both the wound and the medicine. How a shadow like Klingsor can rise from a single moment of self-rejection. And how a soul like Parsifal can grow, not by escaping pain, but by facing it. You meet him before anyone else. You meet Amfortas, a noble guardian of the Grail, a king entrusted with both power and purity. But he was not free from longing. Like every man who carries sacred responsibility, he carried the burden of desire. He ventured into enemy territory, not to conquer but to explore. There he met Kundry, mysterious, seductive, and wounded in her own right. She was sent by Klingsor, a man who had once tried to master his body by force and failed. Klingsor had turned his rejection of desire into control. He created a garden of illusions, using women like weapons. Kundry was one of them. Amfortas didn't fall to Kundry's temptation out of wickedness, but out of naivety. He longed for union, but didn't understand the cost. He stepped into the depths of the unconscious without the strength to carry its weight. In that moment, the sacred spear, the very symbol of self-will and masculine clarity, was stolen by Klingsor, and Amfortas was left wounded, bleeding from a gash that would never close. His fall was not just a mistake, it was a symbolic fracture. He had failed to integrate the sacred and the sensual. He could no longer lead, and the entire kingdom suffered. You see, his wound is not just physical, it is psychological, symbolic. A wound in the generative core, in the creative self, the sexual spiritual center. And what's feeding it is guilt, shame, a sin that he confesses, but a betrayal he cannot forgive himself for. And that's what makes it unbearable. This is the sickness Soren Kierkegaardian talked about once. To know the truth, but not be able to live it. To remember grace, but not be able to receive it. To see the Grail and still feel unworthy to drink from it. And you, the one watching, you feel something in this man, because maybe you too carry a burden like this. You've seen the truth. You've had insights. You know what's right. You've touched the sacred in your way, but something in you faltered. You made a mistake, or many. You betrayed something, or someone. You crossed a line you thought you never would, and now, like him, you hold knowledge without movement, grace without action. There is a voice in your mind that whispers, "You're too far gone. You can never return. You don't deserve to be whole." That voice is cling sores, but you don't know that yet. The true tragedy of Amfortas is that he still has the Grail. He is still in the presence of the sacred, but he no longer trusts himself to hold it. And worse, he no longer trusts others either, because Kundry betrayed him, because no man came to save him, because even God, it seems, has gone silent. So he isolates, he shuts down, he governs in half-light, and all his people, all the land, suffer with him. This is what happens when a man loses faith not in God, but in his own capacity to serve God. Now you understand why Amfortas must be the first figure you meet, because before you chase purity like Parsifal, or confront temptation like Kundry, or face false power like Klingsor, you must face the part of you that already knows and still cannot rise. And yet, something in you still wants to help him. You feel it already. This wounded king is not just someone you pity. You want to save him, to reach him, to prove to him that not all is lost. That impulse, to help the part of you that gave up, is the beginning of compassion. But it is not enough. Not yet. You saw him lying there, Amfortas, not just in pain, exposed. A man who had once carried something sacred, now broken, ashamed, undone. A man once full of purpose, now hollowed out by a wound he could not close. And you stood there silent, not because you didn't care, because you didn't know what to do. That silence became your wound. You are Parsifal now. Amfortas was not just any man. He was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when knowledge is separated from action, a reflection of your future, your potential, your failures yet to come. A masculine soul who had once carried the sacred, the Grail, but lost his will to serve it when he gave in to temptation. He still held the Grail, the sacred knowledge, but he had lost the spear, the will to act on that knowledge. And when the spear was lost, his body was pierced in the very place where life begins. The genitals, the wound of shame, guilt, and loss of creative fire. And that loss tore him open, at the root of his masculinity, where shame, desire, and spiritual exhaustion live. He wasn't just suffering, he understood his suffering. That was the deeper agony. He could name his failures. He knew what he had done. But knowing is not the same as healing. He knew the path, but he couldn't walk it anymore. The knowledge remained, but the spirit to embody it was gone. And you, Parsifal, you felt the weight of all this, even if you couldn't name it. You wanted to help. Maybe you even wanted to ask the healing question, but something held you back. What was it? Fear, uncertainty, a sense that you weren't ready? Because the truth is, asking a healing question isn't just about words. It's not a ritual or a performance. It's a form of responsibility. To ask what ails you and mean it means being ready to do something about the answer, to stay, to carry, to risk being changed. You weren't ready for that, not yet, and so you left. But something followed you, the image of Amfortas. That image burned into your memory, and with it came guilt. Not the guilt of having sinned, but the guilt of understanding too late, the ache of knowing that you could have stepped in and didn't. Not because you were cruel, but because you were unprepared. That's how most of us fail, not from malice, but from immaturity. You began to wonder, Why wasn't I ready? Why didn't I know what to do? And that's when the absences surfaced. A mother who loved you, but feared the world. She kept you close, sheltered, but at a cost. She offered warmth, but not courage. Comfort, but not initiation. And your father? He was never there. Maybe gone. Maybe present, but silent. Either way, he left a space that never got filled. You inherited the desire to serve something noble, but not the structure to carry it. No one gave you the spear, so you walked into life like a dreamer, sincere, open-hearted, but unarmed. That moment with Amfortas wasn't just about him, it was about you, because that's when something ancient began to wake up in you. The instinct to care, to protect, to step in. But instincts must be trained, and empathy, by itself, is not enough. Sympathy without responsibility is just sentiment. You knew then, I don't want to be the one who turns away again. This guilt that you once feared now becomes your fire. Not a fire of shame, but of transformation. You don't want to be innocent anymore. You want to become responsible. You don't walk away now to escape your guilt. You walk forward to become someone who can bear it. The journey has begun. You've felt it before, the pull to return, to go back to the version of yourself that was easier to understand, easier to control. The part of you that chased desire because it was safer than facing silence. The part that seduced others just to feel seen, or followed the world just to avoid being abandoned. And this is exactly where Kundry enters your journey. She's not a villain. She's not evil. She's the feminine mystery that has not yet found peace. She is chaos and wisdom, compassion and vengeance. Her love can wake you up or destroy you. She lives between extremes because no one has ever truly seen her for what she is, a soul divided by a curse, a woman who cannot die because she cannot be forgiven and cannot forgive herself. You meet her after Amfortas, just when you begin to understand what suffering really is. You've seen pain before, you've even felt it. But this is the moment where you start to feel responsible, not just for your pain, but for the pain you see in others, the pain you couldn't prevent, the pain you turned away from. That's the wound you carry now. This is what draws you toward her. Kundry appears seductive and wise. She knows things about you that no one else should. She knows your shame, your fears, your hunger, not just your lust, but the deeper ache behind it, the need to be seen, to be wanted, to be whole. She touches that place inside you that still feels like a child looking for love. And in that moment, her kiss is not just physical, it's symbolic. It's the kiss of memory. When her lips meet yours, the world disappears. And you remember Amfortas, the look in his eyes, his wound, his agony, his silence. You remember standing before him, feeling his pain, and doing nothing. And guilt floods you like a tidal wave. This is the crisis. Do you collapse into guilt as Amfortas did? Do you repress it like Klingsor? Or do you stand your ground, not just for yourself, but for the suffering of another? This is where the shadow of desire is revealed, because now you see it's not about sex. It's not about pleasure. It's about the fear of becoming nobody. If you let go of your desires, who are you? If you stop being ruled by your hunger, what will drive you? Kundry offers you the escape route. She offers you identity, attention, and sweetness. She offers you the illusion of healing through pleasure. But deep down, you know, it's not healing, it's hiding. You push her away, not in hatred, in sorrow, because you see her now, not as a temptress, not as a devil, but as a mirror. She, too, wants to be released from her suffering. She, too, is trapped in cycles of shame, longing, and betrayal. And when you refuse her kiss, not because you don't care, but because you finally do, it breaks something in both of you. This is the beginning of compassion, not just for others, but for the parts of you that wanted to be loved the wrong way. The broken masculine in you finds strength not in domination, but in refusal. The immature feminine in you begins to evolve, not through seduction, but through surrender. Kundry collapses in tears. She screams at you, not because you rejected her, but because you saw her. She has never been seen before. Not like this. You turn away, not in shame, but in grief, because you know what must come next. You must descend into the fortress of Klingsor. You must confront the false self that wants control, the prideful self, the manipulative self, the self that wants power instead of truth. But you don't go in alone. You go carrying the guilt of Amfortas, the tears of Kundry, and the will finally to act. You enter Klingsor's castle not from outside, but from within. It appears when your desire to transcend turns into a desire to control. When you want spiritual power, but not the pain of purification. When you want the image of virtue without the humility that sustains it. Klingsor once sought the Grail. He wanted to be part of that light. But when he couldn't master his own lust, he didn't submit to the wound like Amfortas did. He cut it off. Literally, symbolically, psychologically. He sterilized himself to force entry into the Grail realm. But in doing so, he lost his humanity. He didn't want to purify desire. He wanted to eradicate it. And this is the deep tragedy of the spiritual ego. It mistakes repression for transcendence. It trades healing for power. Klingsor didn't overcome the feminine, he rejected it. And in that rejection, he became twisted, parasitic, hollow. He built a kingdom of illusions, false flowers of temptation, women turned into tools of conquest. But behind all that, he's still just a terrified man who couldn't accept his own weakness, who couldn't forgive himself for failing to embody what he sought. This is where he differs from Amfortas. Both are wounded men, both struggle with lust, shame, and a deep fear of not being worthy of divine love. But Amfortas submits to his wound. He doesn't hide. He doesn't repress. He weeps in public. He lets grace flow through him, even if it shames him. Amfortas holds the Grail, even when he hates himself for it. Klingsor, on the other hand, rejects the Grail because he can't tolerate his imperfection. He cuts away the organ of temptation and builds a throne of control. He says, if I can't be whole, then I will become powerful instead. And here's the terrifying part. Klingsor lives in you. He's the part of you that hates your weakness so much, you'd rather become hard than healed. He's the one who seduces when love feels too vulnerable, who controls when intimacy feels too exposing, who builds a kingdom of ideas of charisma, of manipulation, just to avoid feeling small. And he sends Kundry to break you, not out of love, but out of strategy. She is the remnant of everything he exiled from himself. The feminine spirit, the voice of the earth, the chaos of longing. He can't embody her, so he weaponizes her. Just as you might weaponize your own sensitivity, your own sexuality, your own gifts, if you haven't integrated them. And in this moment, standing in Klingsor's tower, you see what you could become. If you mistake discipline for denial, if you mistake virtue for superiority, if you mistake wounds for proof of failure, if you lose faith in the possibility of being whole without needing to be perfect. But here's the twist. You don't defeat Klingsor by fighting him with his own weapons. You defeat him by doing what he couldn't, by embracing your wound without self-hate, by holding your desire and your devotion in the same breath, by refusing to abandon either your humanity or your humility. This is where Parsifal begins to transform, not by overpowering Klingsor, but by refusing to become him. You return to the Grail Castle not as a boy who seeks victory, but as a man who has wept, been tempted, shattered, forgiven. This is the same place where you first witnessed Amfortas bleeding, but now you see him differently, not as a tragic figure to be saved, but as a mirror of your own inner self. The wound he carries, you felt it too. This time, you don't turn away. You kneel before him, not in pity, but in recognition. You see the grief behind his silence, the trembling will behind his shame, the unbearable grace of someone who never stopped carrying the light, even when they believed they were unworthy of it. Amfortas, this man who once stood between heaven and earth, is still here, broken but breathing. Why? Because the Grail never abandoned him. Because grace doesn't demand perfection. Because even the unworthy can be vessels of the sacred. But here's the deepest truth. Amfortas's greatest pain was not the physical wound. It was betrayal, not by Kundry, but by life itself. He gave everything, his body, his loyalty, his soul, only to be torn open by the very desires he thought he had mastered. And when the other knights looked to him for spiritual nourishment, he gave it. The Grail still flowed through him. But each act of giving deepened his self-loathing. He began to believe that he was a fraud, a failure, that the light he gave others could never redeem him. He lost faith in men. He lost trust in humanity because he could no longer trust himself. Kundry's betrayal wasn't just sexual, it was psychological. It whispered, "You are unclean. You're a hypocrite. You are not who you pretend to be." He began to believe it, until now, because now Parsifal stands before him. Not as a perfect knight, not as a holy warrior, but as a witness. And this is the power that heals Amfortas. Not divine fire, not magical intervention, not even the Grail itself. What heals him is trust. For the first time, he sees someone who sees him, his pain, his guilt, his weakness, and does not look away. Parsifal does not come to fix him. He comes to stand with him, and that's when the alchemy begins. Amfortas feels the Grail again, but this time not as a punishment, not as proof that he must keep suffering to be holy. He feels it as mercy, as grace, as love that was never withdrawn. And Kundry, this woman who has been cursed to wander between ecstasy and agony, kneels too. She sees in Parsifal a man who does not try to dominate her, or run from her, or rescue her. He simply remains, present, awake, and in that moment, she weeps. Not out of guilt, but because she is seen without being used. She dies, but it is not death. It is the end of exile, the end of the curse. You see now, this was never about defeating darkness. It was about restoring relationships. Between man and woman, between strength and sensitivity, between will and grace, between you and your own soul. Because the Grail was never lost. It was simply waiting for someone who could feel everything and still stay. Parsifal became that someone. So can you. The journey ends where it began. Inside. The Grail was never just a cup. It was never a destination. It was a reflection of what? Of what you were afraid to feel, of what you ran from in your desire, your ambition, your guilt, of what still waits in silence. Even now, Parsifal doesn't return as a king. He doesn't claim a throne. He doesn't even speak many words. He simply stands in the center of the Grail Hall, not to perform, but to be. He has integrated the opposites, innocence and wisdom, masculine and feminine, will and surrender. He is not above the pain. He is awake within it. This is not transcendence in the modern sense, a disembodied escape from the world. This is the spiritual embodiment, a return to the sacred within the human. That is why Amfortas is healed. That is why Kundry rests. That is why Klingsor's castle collapses, not because it was destroyed from the outside, but because its illusion has no power over someone who is no longer split within himself. Parsifal has entered the Grail not as a seeker of purity, but as a man who no longer rejects any part of his humanity. And now we return to you. You have traveled this road with him. You have seen the boy who did not understand, the man who made mistakes, the wanderer who bore the weight of not knowing, the warrior who faced his desire and did not run, the soul who chose to feel rather than flee. What now? You know too much to pretend again. You've seen too deeply to go back to chasing shadows. But that doesn't mean you live in solemnity. It means you live in truth, in laughter that isn't hiding pain, in tears that are not a sign of weakness, in strength that does not fear being gentle, in love that doesn't demand to be repaid. The Grail now lives in your choices. When you forgive, even though no one says sorry. When you pause instead of react. When you allow desire to move through you without letting it rule you. When you trust again, not because it's safe, but because it's sacred. You are Parsifal, you are Amphortus, you are Kundry. You are the wound, the fear, the shame, the grace. And most of all, you are the one who remains. Not untouched, but transformed. Not elevated, but integrated. And now the world waits, not for a savior, not for a saint, but for a human being who knows how to hold the Grail, not in his hands, but in his heart.